Welcome back, everyone. In this episode, we're going to be looking at a inking technique called stippling, and stippling works with dots. We'll talk about that here in a minute. When you are doing this technique, you can use dip pens, you can use Sharpies, you can use other brands. The key is make sure that you find one that have relatively small nib or small tips on them, so that you get a much better effect. If you're working on a large project like a poster, then you can go with tips that are a little bit bigger. But when you're working on something this small, the smaller the tip, the better. So what exactly is stippling? Stippling is nothing more than drawing with a series of dots or little tick marks. So it works very simple. You just start by putting the dots onto your surface. We'll talk about how to use them to shade. When you want to create straight lines, you just put the dots close together like so. You can create curved lines as well. When you want to change the values, all you got to do is put the dots closer together. The closer the dots are together, the darker the area will look. The further apart, the lighter the area will look. That's really all there is to it. Now, this technique is super easy. It's real easy to control, but you have to have a lot of patience because it does take a very long time to do a drawing. I'm just going to focus on the eyeball, again because it takes so long. So I'm just going to show you how I do the eyeball. Now, what I've done already is I've already drawn out the skeleton and the eyeball, and we know that this area of the eyeball is going to be black. This area is going to be probably a medium, depending on the color of the eye. The eyeball itself is generally white, but it's not pure white. There's going to be shadows in it. There's going to be some reds in it. We're not going to add colors on this one, but a red is like a mid-tone. And then these little pieces here are like a darkish reddish color. So we have to make those like variations of mid-tones. And we're going to do that all with dots. So the first thing, just like anything else, that I'm going to decide on is where's the light source going to come from. So I'm going to put the light source over here. And I've already kind of indicated where I want some highlights to be. But the rest of it I'm just going to do as I go. Unlike the other techniques that we've done, we are actually not going to outline this with lines. We're actually going to do everything with dots. That's the traditional way of doing stippling. So when I start putting the dots in, I'm going to start off by putting them kind of far apart, just to kind of get a very basic idea of what this is going to look like. And I'm not going to worry about the shading right away. I just want to go through and kind of establish the outlines, but using dots this time. Where the light is, I'm going to put those dots further apart. I can always add more, as you're going to see here in a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and finish outlining this with dots, and then I'll be back to show you how to actually start to shade this. Alright, so I have everything outlined with dots, but I'm not going to erase the pencil lines just yet. I'm going to continue working on the stippling, and then after I'm done, I'm going to go ahead and erase the pencil lines. Okay, so it's actually very simple. All I'm going to do is start darkening the areas by placing the dots closer together. So I'm going to start with a mid-tone. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start putting in the dots kind of far apart. And the areas that I want to go darker, I'll just add more dots later. And the areas that I want to keep nice and bright, I'm either going to keep the dots really far apart, or I'm going to leave them blank. So like now on this left edge right here, I'm going to go ahead and start putting additional dots to make this left edge even darker. And very similar to when we're cross hatching and doing the washes, you kind of want to build things up in layers so that you can kind of keep track of. It's just easier to build up a dark zone than it is to start with a dark zone and then go to light. Um, Now, as you get more experience, you can do it any way you want to, right? So, like, there are times when I'm doing a drawing that I'll go ahead and put in all of my darks first, and then go back and then build up my shadows, or excuse me, my highlights a little bit at a time. Now we know that the light source is here, so this part of the eyeball is going to be a little bit darker. So I'm just going to start putting in some dots, but I'm going to put them relatively far away because I don't want this part of the eyeball to look as dark. However, when I get to the iris and the pupil, yes, I'm going to be going even darker. Let's go ahead and start working on this pupil and the iris. So when I do the iris, I'm going to start by putting these dots a little bit closer than the ones that I did here. And it depends on the color that you want the eye to be. So for example, if this eyeball had a brown iris, then obviously I would have to make these dots fairly close together. But if the eyeball had, say, a blue or a green, then the dots would be further apart. For the pupil, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start off far apart, and then I'm just going to keep building them up and getting them closer and closer and closer together. You'll notice, I don't know if you can see it, but because the paper is a little bit wet, that it wants to rise. So sometimes, especially when I'm doing the dark values, or if the paper is not very thick, I'll use like an eraser to hold the paper down like so it's not moving, and then the ink will be released. So when I lift this up, by holding the paper down, it'll release the paper. I have had it, especially when I work with this type of ink, where I've lifted it up and the paper has come up with it. So it doesn't happen very often, but the paper that I'm using right now, it's only 80-pound paper, so it's not very thick. So it tends to warp a little bit more than the thicker paper, which is why I always let things dry, because if I keep working on it while it's super wet, then I run the risk of damaging the paper. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to work on the iris. The iris has to be darker than the eyeball, so I'm going to keep working on it, but not as dark as the pupil. And the iris has these, like, almost these spokes, I guess you can call them. I don't really know what they're called, but they create a pattern. And you see it a lot. If the person has light color eyes, you'll actually see that pattern more than on a person that has like brown eyes. So when I'm stippling, if I want to, I can actually mimic that pattern. If you make a mistake when you're working with stippling, Whiteout sells a whiteout pen that actually works pretty good. You just press on it and it creates little white dots. So it's actually perfect for correcting mistakes with stippling. It can also be used for stippling on a dark surface, which is a very cool effect. Right. Remember that from time to time, back this thing away. So I'm going to try to do it with the camera, because the further away that you place it, the better the shadows look. When you look at it up close, like this, all you see are dots. Okay. So, and that's all you want to see. So we don't want to outline. So I'm going to go ahead and work on the skeleton, but I'm going to do that off camera. because the process is exactly the same, and it does take a while. And then I'll show you the finished product when it's done. I went through and I erased all the pencil lines with the exception of the light source, and now I'm checking it over to make sure that I'm happy with the results. So all in all, I think it looks pretty good. There are a few areas here that I feel that need more dots because the light source is here. That means these over here would be a little bit darker. And then the separation between each bone here needs to be a little bit darker. But all in all, I think it looks pretty well. Keep in mind that whenever you're checking your work, you have to get away from it. Right? Because when you're looking at it up close like this, right, all you're seeing is a bunch of dots. So if you really want your eyes to see the shadows, you have to move it away. Typically what I do is I put it on a wall and walk away about 6 feet or so, and then take a look at it, and then I can tell whether or not I need to make adjustments. But with the camera, I can just zoom back and forth so you can kind of get a general idea what it looks like. So this is pretty much done, and it's just one more of the techniques that we use when we're working with inking. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.